And joining me in the studio, Dr. Emily Landau, head of the Arms Control and Regional Security Program at the INSS, and Foreign Affairs correspondent Owen Alterman. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
So, Dr. Landau, we had talked about this deal on and on and on through the interim phase, through the signing. If we're looking a year back at arms control, at nuclear safety globally, how would you rate it?
Well, look, unfortunately, from the beginning, this deal was not about ending Iran's nuclear program in the sense of ending the option for Iran to move to a nuclear weapons capability at some point in the future. The P5+1 unfortunately gave up on that goal from the start, and their much more limited goal was just to move breakout from what they assessed was around 2 or 3 months to break out a year ago to about a year. But it's not about ending this crisis. And Iran's ability at some point in the future to move to a nuclear weapons capability has remained.
And so in terms of transparency, the pouring cement in its facilities, having UN inspectors inside, doesn't that add to the safety, to preventing an Iranian nuclear program in the future?
Look, UN inspectors, IAEA inspectors were in the nuclear facilities before this deal because of the provisions of the safeguard agreements that every non-nuclear weapon state member of the NPT has with the IAEA. That wasn't a problem. So there might be, it might be a little bit more frequent. That's not where the problems were. The problems were with facilities, non-nuclear facilities, military facilities, especially Parchin, which was in the news so much, where Iran was suspected of carrying out military-related nuclear activities. And according to the NPT, the terms of the NPT, IAEA inspectors were barred. So this deal was supposed to take care of that problem and to ensure that the IAEA could go, anywhere, anytime. Unfortunately, the deal did not grant the IAEA those powers.
Oh, and in the bigger picture, what's your view on this deal, what it means for the Middle East? There was a lot of discussion about the implications from markets to the Middle East. We'll get to ECO in a little while, but how would you rate it?
Well, look, in terms of grading, it depends where you're sitting. If you're sitting in Washington, I think this deal is a B. Why? What's the U.S. interest in the Middle East? What's the Obama administration strategy? Something called offshore balancing. That means the U.S. isn't present in the Middle East, but there are a few different loci of power, a few different centers of power that balance each other out, so there's no one power that takes over the region. This deal helps the U.S. to do that, but what's the problem? The continuing hostility from Iran. That's something Washington would very much like to see changed. Hasn't happened. From Tehran, I think this deal gets an A. This deal gets an A. Iran took its nuclear program and leveraged it brilliantly to create for itself an expanded regional role and to keep the card of the nuclear program in its pocket for 8 or 10 years from now.
So you mentioned Washington. Let's get one more perspective on that. Dr. Trita Parsi is the founder and current president of the National Iranian American Council. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So you are one of the top experts on this
amount of time.
עכשיו לשאלת היום שאחרי, לאן צועדת טורקיה? האם לעימות פנימי אולי...
pretty much doing what they were doing before in the region. Extend
Well, let me just...
Back to you, Dr. Emily Landau. You had a pretty strong reaction to what Dr. Parsi said.
Well, let me just say, the message coming from the Obama administration from when this deal was announced is that it cuts off all pathways to a bomb forever. That is simply not in line with the reality of this deal. We don't have time to go into all of the problems, but there are holes, there are weaknesses, there are flaws. I mentioned with regard to the inspection regime, not being able to gain necessarily timely access to suspicious military facilities, and there are many more flaws. So this mantra, that this is cut off all paths to the bomb is simply not the case. Let me just say about what Iran is doing in the region. Stepping up its missile program is not in line with what we just heard, that Iran is not escalating things. Things that are going on in Syria, we have seen escalation since the deal was announced. Iran is pushing the envelope. It's testing the will of the international community to push back, and unfortunately what we're seeing is not much in terms of pushback.
So let's look at one big part of this. It's also linked to how Iran behaves in the Middle East, the economy. Much was made of what a post-sanctions Iran would look like. It sounds fairly optimistic from this report. What's the whole story?
Well, there are some people in the REIT, despite those numbers, saying that foreign companies, European banks, haven't come back in Iran in the numbers and to the extent that was expected. And there are two camps about why. One camp says it's because of Washington. There's still a residue of sanctions. There's still some sanctions on the books. And companies are leery of breaking those sanctions and getting in trouble with the U.S. government, so they're risk averse and they're staying away. Then there's another camp. And this other camp says, no way. It has nothing to do with Washington. This is about things in Tehran, about corruption in Iran, about the lack of an independent judiciary, Revolutionary Guard control over the economy, and that's the real reason. We'll have to see how things shape out. One final note about the regional picture. I think there was an Iran deal that made a big change in the Middle East, but it wasn't the nuclear deal of July 2015. It was the interim deal from a few years before. That's what set in motion all of the processes that we're seeing of the United States coming closer to Iran. That's the one that really made the change.
Oh, and Alterman, Dr. Emily Landau, thanks very much for weighing in. We'll look at one more angle.